when someone tells you that your life is not going to look the way you pictured at the baby shower, at the wedding shower, at the whatever it was, you're allowed to feel, and you should feel. But at the end of the day, how do you act?
You're listening to As You Go, a production of Free Will Baptist Women's Ministries. At Free Will Baptist Women's Ministries, we're all about helping women fulfill our role in the Great Commission. Jesus said, as you're going, make disciples. So in our podcast, we want to focus on being a disciple, growing in discipleship and in obedience, and then making disciples. Thank you for joining us on As You Go. Today I have with me a beautiful young woman, April Jimmeye, who I recently met in California. Now I say I met her. Actually, I probably had met her before, but we were connecting the dots when we met recently in California. And I've asked April to come on the show today because she's just got a wealth of information and experience that I think would be really pertinent to those of you who are in the trenches with parenting. And particularly, I don't want to steal her thunder, but particularly April is very qualified, both educationally and experientially, to speak about parenting children with special needs and things like autism. So April, thank you. Welcome to the podcast today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to it.
April, tell us just a little bit by way of self-introduction, where you're from and, kind of what you're into.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. My husband grew up in California. We met at Bible College at Southeastern. And we picked a coast. We thought about meeting in the middle, but didn't really want to live in Tornado Alley. So we wound up here in California. I grew up at Good News Free Will Baptist Church. My dad is Glenn Johnson. Some Free Will Baptist folks might recognize that name on the East Coast anyway.
Yeah, he's a really great guy that I went to college with back in the day. And you have how many siblings, April?
I'm one of 6.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And you're number what?
I'm number 2.
Number 2 of 6. That's awesome. I hear you saying you picked a coast because I think people who grew up on the coast have a very hard time living away from the coast. But you really did have to pick, right? East or West Coast. So you picked the West.
Yeah, we did. And we're not near the coast, really. It still takes
that's true.
to get there, but close enough. Close enough.
Yeah. I mean, when I think California, I think coast, but you're right. There's a lot of California that's not really on the coast, isn't there?
Yeah.
Well, April, I always ask all the guests that are on As You Go this question, and I don't know what you're going to say, so that's always fun for me. When you were a little girl, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, and you told me you were going to ask this question, and I
usually give warning.
I remember that what I wanted to be, and nothing really stuck out as far as an occupation that I wanted to be when I grew up. There wasn't anything that, I just shot for, but I do remember being a junior, senior in high school. My sister had already headed off to Bible college. My parents were kind of making it clear, that's where you're going to go to. I didn't want to go.
I hear you.
And so what I didn't want to be was Free Will Baptist. For some reason.
Okay.
For some reason in my mind, I thought, if I can convince my dad that I'm not Free Will Baptist, then he can't make me go.
I see.
I don't know why I thought that would work on my dad. It wouldn't have, but I thought it would. So I remember sitting down with a big cup of coffee, healthy dose of pessimism, and a couple Pick-a-Really books, and some 4 Views of Eternal Security by Dr. Pinson. And I just was going to not be Free Will Baptist by the end of it.
Okay, all right.
I was going to find the flaw. And, I didn't. I came out more Free Will Baptist than ever.
That's hilarious. So you don't know what you wanted to be, but you knew what you didn't want to be.
I didn't want to be Free Will Baptist.
And just for the record, you are still Free Will Baptist, right?
I am.
You're attending a Free Will Baptist church in California. That's funny.
Yep. Dr. Pinson's book was a little too good, a little too persuasive.
Mm-hmm. So April, do you have a stubborn side?
Oh, very.
Okay. I don't really know you that well, but I'm kind of reading between the lines. If you knew what you didn't want to be, it's kind of like, Don't tell me
Yeah.
what I can't do.
That's yes, you pulled that string. Yeah, that is me for
So
sure.
when you were a student in Bible college and you were looking ahead to the future, what were some of your aspirations?
My parents wanted me to go to Southeastern, and there weren't a whole lot of majors to choose from.
Yeah, that's true.
Um, no, I didn't want to teach, and
Mhm.
didn't really feel the call to mission field. So, at one point, I had done religious arts major, ended up moving into business, but I didn't really feel like
Mm.
any of that fit. I knew I was where I was supposed to be, but I didn't know where I was headed.
Okay. Did you
Um,
picture marriage, motherhood?
I did
Mhm.
picture marriage.
Mhm.
I wouldn't let myself picture motherhood.
I see.
I grew up type 1 diabetic. I was diagnosed at
Oh, I
four
didn't
years
know that.
old.
Hmm.
And so I wasn't sure if that was God's plan for me. And I didn't want to get too attached to a dream that may or may not come to pass.
But how
And
many children do you have, April?
I have three. It
And
came
how was
together.
that for you as a type 1 diabetic?
So with my very first child, it was rather traumatic.
Really?
Yes, he flatlined. I
Oh no.
C-section. It was
Oh
an
wow.
ordeal with Judah.
That-
All's well that ends well.
So
So
Judah is how old?
Judah is now 13.
Okay. And then you had,
And then the next was Gideon.
okay.
Um, and he is 4 years younger than Judah. He's 9.
Hmm.
And our final one is Lydia Jane.
Oh, so you got two boys and a girl.
I
Awesome.
do. Yeah.
So when they were born, and you were very grateful to have had this dream that you didn't even dare dream
Right.
fulfilled as a type 1 diabetic. That's awesome. So, what was your first indication that maybe your babies weren't exactly textbook?
Yeah. The gift wasn't unwrapping the way I thought it would.
Okay, that's a
Um,
good way to put it.
and so Gideon was about 2 years old. His language was developing, but
Mhm.
everything was just kind of different.
Hmm.
We weren't bonding the way I did with Judah. And, everybody kept telling me, don't compare. I mean, he's your second child. It's going to be different.
Right, right.
I get it. I get it. All kids are different. All kids are different.
Mhm.
And things just kept getting harder and
Hmm.
harder. I wanted to just fix it. I was reading the parenting books. I was doing the Google searches. I was, we everything I could think to do, and it just obviously terrible twos are terrible for everybody, or it wouldn't be a thing.
Indeed, yeah.
But there were a lot of issues where it wasn't just hard for me. I could tell it was hard for him,
Mhm.
where I wasn't able to meet his needs.
Okay.
Um, and
So a
and
lot
that
of outbursts and things like that,
oh,
uncontrollable
absolutely.
behavior. Mhm.
Yeah, what a lot of people will refer to as meltdowns
Right,
and
meltdowns. Mhm.
sensory behaviors that just,
Mhm.
I couldn't help him
Mhm.
scratch that itch.
So did you know a lot about autism or special needs at that point?
No,
So
I
what
did.
did you think? I mean, did you think I'm a bad mom because I don't know how to handle this child?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I did. And
Mhm.
and for us, this part of the journey wasn't occurring in a vacuum either. I was also going through, well, I had just had Lydia. I I had Graves' disease at the time,
Okay.
and so I was.
Want to tell us what that is? I'm not
It's
very
the
familiar with that.
it's the opposite of low thyroid. It's
Ah, okay,
hyperthyroidism.
gotcha.
But my resting heart rate was just super high. I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Some days it was hard to get off the couch. And so
Mm-hmm.
on top of already thinking, well, I'm a bad mom, I literally couldn't be the mom I
Yeah,
wanted to be.
right.
And that was a very, very hard time.
Did you have help, April?
No,
You were in California already?
We were already in
So
California.
thousands of miles away from your mom, your sister.
Thousands.
Mm-hmm.
And Johnny's family was here, but they had a lot going on in their own lives at the time. And we had moved to the Exeter church, it was a very small church. Um, and I'm sure the few ladies that we did have in the church at the time wanted to help, but it was primarily an older congregation.
Right.
And no, it was just us.
Okay, so the challenges of a child is atypical, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Did you often feel like people were kind of looking at you askance and going, why don't they do something about that child and his meltdowns?
I really did, a lot. And
Because a lot of people are so simplistic when they see behavior that in their child would have just indicated, acting out. I've been in situations like that with some of my loved ones who have children similar to yours. And it's like people are looking at them like, I can't believe they're letting that child act like that.
They think, I could fix that. And it's what they don't realize is how much children who aren't on the spectrum learn by accident. And nobody, regardless of whether you spank or use timeouts or use positive reinforcement or whatever your parenting method is, very rarely do you sit down and say, okay, this weekend we're working on cooperation. This weekend we're working on communication. We're going to work on toleration this weekend. Those are all things that kids who are socializing and don't have sensory breakups causing issues with that, kids will pick those up on their own because kids are just so wildly efficient with their behavior.
And they intuitively pick those things up.
Yes, because by the time they're 2 years old, they know that if they want cookies, they can just say cookies and get cookies because they've looked at your eyes and they've tried the other things and they know this is the easiest path from A to B.
Gotcha.
But with an autistic child, there's other things going on. They may not be going from A to B. They may have a lot of just noise in their environment. They may not be communicating the way that we're communicating. And that doesn't mean they can't learn to do it. They can, but you may have to teach that on purpose. And that's part of what I love about autism so much is how much you can intentionally train what you want them to learn because they're not picking up all the junk by accident.
So there's a plus.
There's all kinds of pluses.
So many pluses. Isn't that great?
Oh, yeah, count your blessings. But it took me a while to see some pluses, if I'm being honest.
How did you begin to see them? How did God intervene in your life to allow you to start seeing them and seeing the pluses and learn how to cope with your situation? Talk to us about the path that you went down.
Yeah. So once I got my Graves' disease taken care of, a couple surgeries out of the way.
So you were feeling better.
Got to a place where I was healthy and I could do what I needed to do with my kids. We started therapy with them. My son received his diagnosis at 4. My daughter received her diagnosis at 2.
Okay. So this is Gideon and Lydia.
Gideon and Lydia, yes.
Judah is not autistic?
Judah has not received a diagnosis.
Okay,
no.
Gotcha.
And so we started therapy with them around, as soon as we could, got it up and running. Lydia received speech and ABA. Gideon received ABA.
And tell us what ABA is for those of us who don't know.
ABA is applied behavioral analysis.
That's right.
And when it's done well and when it's done right, it looks at the environment, it looks at the child, and it says, how can we make the environment work for this child? Right. What's not working and what can we fix? It's not an attempt to make them not autistic. That's not the goal.
Because that's not going to happen.
No. And
something they're going to deal with, and they have to learn how to cope and how to function with their set of stimuli that they're getting, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. And so, and a lot of parents, when they are doing therapies and stuff with their kids, they're exhausted, they
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So they kind of will just check their kids into therapy and go nap or shower or whatever they need to do.
Right.
I didn't know that was an option.
Yeah, you
I
wanted to learn too, because it's about as much, it's probably as much about the parent, parents coping and modifying the environment as it is about the child learning, right?
right at that phase in their life, I was their environment.
Yeah,
I
you're
wanted,
trying to be the best mom you can.
yeah, absolutely. So I was very involved in their therapies, wanted to know everything that I could do to make it work for them.
And in that
Um,
process, you got so interested in it that you decided to go back to school. Is that correct?
I did. I
So tell
did.
us about that.
So I went back, I had to finish off my bachelor's at Liberty, and then I did my master's through University of West Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my internship to become a BCBA, I did that just through a mix of programs. And so I'm now a board certified behavior analyst. I can do this therapy that my kids have benefited from for other children, and I love that. And again, one of the things that I love helping do is teaching those skills of toleration, cooperation, communication, and then the next step really is perspective taking. Those tend to be the skills that if an autistic person does not develop those by accident, are the most problematic for them in their lives.
So what is one of the lessons that you would have learned that you would be quick to give as far as advice to other parents that
Yeah.
are trying to love and teach their children on the spectrum?
Well, one of the things I've learned, and I think this applies to kids on and off the spectrum,
Okay.
but I don't think I would have learned it if my kids hadn't been on the spectrum. So
Okay.
I'm very grateful for the lesson. But the difference between training a child through a can't and a won't,
Okay.
or training a grown-up through a can't and a won't. Very often, we look at a skill, something we need them to do.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, let's say, sitting in church.
Okay.
That's a
That's a
goal of ours. We want them to sit through a service.
yeah.
And a lot of times we say, well, they just need to have self-control. I just, and some kids might have it. Some kids might be able to sit down and they know that sitting there makes mom and dad happy, or sitting there is just not that hard for them,
Right.
whatever it is. And they can get from the song service to the invitation with zero issues.
Okay.
And that was my oldest child. And so I just thought I was a great mother.
Yes. Oh, right. Yes, of course.
Right. I was killing it.
My first child, I don't have any children who were on the spectrum, but my first child was just such a textbook perfect, compliant child.
Right.
I thought I was just the most fantastic mom, And then I had my second child who is, if you told him do this, he would do the opposite.
Mhm.
And they're just so different in personality. So I was like, wow, it really wasn't even me the whole time.
Yeah.
I just got a easy, I'll put that in air quotes, child the first time. Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of people do. But then the environment is different. The child is different.
True.
Things are just different. And so we think, well, the first kid could, why can't you?
Very dangerous to compare like that, right?
It is. It is. And the first kid could, why won't you? I think is how we end up treating it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we tend to try to punish away the bad behavior, or maybe even be like, well, if you do this, I'll give you this big reward. But if they're literally not capable of it, they just can't do it. And so we have to say, all right, where are they? Where are you at this? Can you sit for 5 minutes and then get up and go?
Mm-hmm.
Can you sit for the entire service but color? Can you sit for the entire service if I let you walk up and down our pew? Or I guess that's not sitting at all, but
well, if they're being contained though and not disrupting others.
And then you look at where they are and raise the bar ever so gradually, rather than just having it up here and say, why won't you jump?
That makes sense.
And when you treat it like a can't, rather than a won't, and you
Mhm.
train up the skill, you're much more likely to get success with the skill in the long run
Mhm.
than if you just say, you're not doing what I need you to do. I'm going to punish that down, or I'm going to try
Mhm.
to motivate it up. When we treat behavior like a coin,
Mhm.
when something is happening on this side of the coin, you know,
Mhm.
whatever it is, they're not doing what they need to do. They're doing something they're not supposed to do.
Mhm.
There's always something on the other side of the coin
Uh,
that we can train up.
I see.
And so when they're throwing tantrums
Mhm.
because they can't communicate, we train
Right.
up communication.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the when when we can make those, when we can train with reinforcement, when
Mhm.
we can, we've found, studies have shown that that does work better and last longer than
Mhm.
punishment.
Okay,
You're
gotcha.
training up skills, and I like to think of it as the fruit of the spirit. When Paul writes about, this whole big long list of behaviors that nobody wants to see in their child, um,
Gotcha.
says, and such were some of you.
Mhm.
Don't be these things. This is what God wants to train up in your life.
Mhm. So there's a lot of application to our spiritual life that you've learned in this
Oh,
field as you've studied
absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the can't and the won't. Let's talk a little bit more about that. I
Yeah.
think that I have, without giving away any confidentialities, I'm very close to a child that has some sensory issues. And a lot of times, in trying to figure her out, because I've never been around a child like that before, I was like, is this an act of willfulness? Or is there something else going on here? And I think it took us a while to realize there was something else going on. It wasn't that she would not do XYZ behavior. It's
Yeah.
that she could not. Is that
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about, right?
That is what I'm talking about. And um, if, to receive an autism diagnosis, and I don't know if this learner that you're referring to,
She is slightly on the spectrum,
yeah,
yes.
okay, but to receive an autism diagnosis,
Mhm.
there there's multiple aspects to it.
Mhm.
One has to be social.
Mhm.
There's something going on in the social realm. And I think this is what leads a lot of people to say, well, we're all a little bit autistic, because we all sometimes feel like, oh, I didn't know what to say in that
You
conversation,
feel
or I'd rather
awkward or
stay
whatever.
home in my pajamas. Right.
Gotcha.
But for an autistic person to receive a diagnosis, it has to be at such a level that it's affected their communication and it's affected their behavior.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you don't get the diagnosis.
I
So when
see.
somebody says, "Oh, we're all a little autistic," I think they're normally just trying to find common ground. I
Mhm.
don't find harm in that statement, but we're not all a little autistic.
I got
Um,
you. It's a matter of degree. It's a spectrum.
it is a spectrum.
It's a
It's a huge
continuum.
spectrum.
So it's
Mhm.
like in anything else, we're somewhere on that continuum. But in
Right.
order for it to be um, problematic, it has to have a certain degree.
It
That's
has to
when you get a
be
diagnosis.
affecting other areas of your life.
Gotcha. That's
And
right.
we don't know whether the social is affected by the sensory or the sensory affects the social. We're not really sure there, but it's something to do with that. And
Mhm.
so, but for the learner that you're questioning whether or not she can, um, she probably hasn't. She probably can at some point,
Mhm.
but she has to learn the skills.
It has to learn. Mhm.
And some learners won't ever get there. Um, some may, with very intentional training.
Mhm.
Um, some may not be motivated by the things that motivate us,
Mhm.
and that can be really confusing. We think, well, a kid should work for good grades because good grades motivate me, or a kid should work for smiles and winks from their mom because that's what worked for me. And when a child on the spectrum isn't participating in the same social way that we do, they're not going to be reinforced in the same social ways that we are. Therefore, it's going to affect
Gotcha.
the can and the
So
whole.
I'm assuming you learned quite a lot with your second child. And then when your third child came along, you probably recognized earlier
I
what
did
was going
recognize
on and knew how to handle it a little better.
um
Or was it a completely new child, new set of challenges?
with girls on the spectrum, things are different.
I see.
Getting her diagnosed was a little bit harder,
Oh,
actually,
really? Mm-hmm.
than getting Gideon diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
She was almost completely nonverbal. I say nonverbal. There's a lot of she
Gotcha.
she would make noises. We kind of could guess at what she
You
wanted.
interpreted them more, but probably other people outside your family couldn't. Mm-hmm.
No idea. And so had it not been for her communication deficits, though, it would have been almost impossible to get her diagnosed, because a lot of the diagnostic criteria is written for little boys and how they.
Really? Now, is that because autism is more prevalent in boys?
No, I think autism is more prevalent in boys because of how the diagnostic criteria
They're
is
just
written.
diagnosing it more
Yeah.
readily. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
And it tends to be more problematic for boys, especially in the earlier years, which makes sense.
By that, you mean they're exhibiting more aggressive behaviors?
Aggressive behaviors, or just things that make it harder to be in a classroom, things like that. Girls,
behaviors, yeah.
Right. Girls tend to have an easier time getting through, the early grades and stuff. So a lot of times they're later to the diagnostic table.
At what age did your children receive a diagnosis?
So Gideon was 4, Lydia was 2.
Okay.
2, almost 3. Mm-hmm. And then I actually received my own diagnosis in my 30s.
Are you autistic?
I am.
Okay. So you're on the spectrum and you did not know that?
I didn't know it after having gone through it twice with my kids. I said, I would have checked a lot of these boxes when I was little. And so
okay, let's talk about that for a minute. As an adult receiving a diagnosis, what kind of impact did that have on you? Was it like a relief?
It was a relief. This isn't my quote, but there's value in knowing that you're not a broken horse. You're a really good zebra.
I love it.
And so for me, it made a lot of my life make sense. And for me, I wasn't. This is not typical. Usually, when you get a diagnosis, you are struggling in some way. You're looking for help. I had just been through it twice with my children, and knew that I was going into the field. So I sought out a diagnosis for informational purposes.
Gotcha.
But usually, I don't think I've ever met an adult who got a diagnosis that was sorry they did so. It's usually.
Is it kind of like, oh, this makes so much sense now?
Yeah, it's very rarely a crutch. It's usually a compass.
That's great. Well, you're using great word pictures there. I love that. The zebra and the horse. That's good. That's good. So when you were a child, April, were you frustrated a lot, or were your parents frustrated? If you had been raised by people who were very well informed about the spectrum, would they have probably seen the signs?
Well, when my parents were raising me, nobody was very well.
I know. Yes, I know. There's no blame to be cast, but if it were now and it was someone different who was very much looking for the signs, you believe they were there?
I really feel like my parents did a lot of things super well. That I mean, we were homeschooled. I got one-on-one attention more than I wanted sometimes. And a lot of even the principles of what goes into, applied behavior analysis and stuff. I was like, oh, my mom's been doing that for years.
So I don't, maybe you can chalk that up to the Holy Spirit giving her wisdom as she prayed for guidance and, raising each of her individual children. She had 6 of them. I'm sure you were all 6 different.
Yes. Yep.
That's a
And
great testimony for the Lord's goodness.
yeah, I do believe that my brother Nathan was also likely on the spectrum. And,
Mhm.
he also struggled with communication, cooperation, toleration. And I have questioned, if we had better diagnostics back then, if there had been
Mhm.
more information, more help, more tools, because my brother, unlike the rest of us, always struggled. He was the black sheep of the family. He couldn't find his way.
Mhm.
Um, and he died very young because of it.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, though, I think that I don't know, how things played out for Nathan
Mhm.
eternally,
I understand that. Mhm.
but I think there was a lot of can't there that we thought was a won't. And
Mhm.
when he got to stand before God, God understood.
Mhm. I hear your heart there, and I suspect you're right. Mm.
So we'll
Because
see
we
what,
really ultimately have one judge, and that is God. And he
yeah,
does understand the difference when we can't and when we won't.
yeah,
And honestly, I'm really glad you brought this whole can't and won't topic up today because I've never one time thought about it in my whole entire life. Because a lot of times in popular psychology, when like life coach kind of people are talking to you about like losing weight or some such habit thing, it's like, well, is it that you can't or is it that you won't? And they always lay that on you, and as if it's always, I won't. Does that make
mm,
sense? And I
yeah,
maybe in trying to just develop positive habits, it might be legitimate. I don't know. But I think that there's so much of life this could apply to as far as if you get into like addictions,
yeah,
addictive behaviors, bad choices that people seem to repetitively jump into,
yeah,
and a lot of us, especially in the church, I am afraid to say, are probably really quick to say, this is a willful thing.
yeah,
And maybe it is sometimes. Maybe it started out that way sometimes. But when you add on the component, and I'm just talking off the top of my head, so I may say something really stupid, but when you add on in the component of like a chemical addiction or that dopamine rush that you get, even when it's not a chemical addiction, but some other addictive behavior. And then if you add in the layer of spiritual oppression
yeah.
by the enemy,
Hmm.
I do believe there are situations where we're looking at people as a won't. We're looking at the behavior as a won't when they've gotten themselves into a situation where it's a can't.
Yeah,
And so I don't know, maybe that verse that talks about this kind doesn't come out but by prayer and fasting. Sometimes it's the free will has been compromised
yeah,
through illness you know, or bad choices repetitively made until a stronghold has been formed. I don't know. I've got
yeah.
to do a lot of thinking about that. That's really fascinating, April. Am I off in left field?
I don't think so. I'm following you if you are, but
Okay.
um, yeah. And for me, it's been
A little
helpful.
more compassion is called for, is all I'm trying to say.
Oh my goodness, yes. I
And
I
a whole
don't.
lot more listening with our hearts to see what is really going on with this person.
Yeah, I don't think compassion is ever wasted
No, no.
on any human, but especially when there's other elements going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and when it's a won't, we do need to step back and say, how can we fix the motivation?
Mm-hmm.
They need to understand that Christ is not pleased. Sometimes we need to be radically candid. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that can be the right path to motivating this person. Sometimes we need to, look at what motivates them to do other things. Can we bring that in here? Are they very socially motivated? Can we use that? But
Mm-hmm.
when it's a can't, when it's a can't, what are the steps to take to get it to where it's a can?
Mm-hmm.
And something can be a won't one day that's a can't another day.
Yeah. We are
They're
complicated, aren't we?
yes, and that doesn't make it easy on us. But I think it's important. Lately I've been diving into the book of Mark. I
Okay.
just love that book. And when you look at Jesus in the book of Mark, it almost looks like somebody needed to buy him a map. I mean, he made the earth, and it was like, do you know where you're going? He's kind of just all over the place
Oh, that's funny. Yeah.
in the book of Mark. And the disciples had to be thinking again with this, like,
Uh-huh.
because I'm
No
sure
rhyme to, no reason to his, what's that? Rhyme?
no rhyme or reason to
Yeah, there it
his
is.
going.
Yeah.
And I'm sure their feet were tired, but
Uh-huh.
a lot of what Jesus was doing there was going from person who needed him to person who needed him.
Mm-hmm.
And when the social overlapped the moral
Mm-hmm.
in the book of Mark, or in any of the miracles, but especially in the book. And please understand, I'm not equating autism to, demon possession
Oh,
or
no.
in any way. Let me be clear about
Oh,
that.
absolutely not. Nor was I.
But there are times when, because you're dealing with social looks like moral.
Mm-hmm.
When you're dealing with someone that doesn't know the rules about hugging,
Mm-hmm.
we treat it like a moral issue
Mm-hmm. I
when
can
it's
see that.
social. And when Jesus was bouncing all over the book of Mark, um, whenever there was something where the social overlapped the moral, where there was someone with demon possession, where there was lepers to be found,
Mm-hmm.
he had to go find those people.
Right.
They were either a parent was the only person that would get to Jesus for them, or they were alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that says a lot about how the church deals with the social and the moral. I think a lot of times we leave these people out on their own because we don't understand the can't and the won't.
We're not seeking them out like he was.
We're not seeking them out like he was, and we're not understanding them like he was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to do that. We got to try. They deserve him just as much as, the ones that people were ripping the roofs off for. They had.
Yeah, he was paralyzed, but
Do that. Yeah. And I love any ministry that gets people to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times where there's a social and that looks like a moral aspect to it, these folks are alone and they need Jesus brought to them.
I have to say this. I just made a trip to Japan to see my daughter and my grandkids and in over there. And when the Sunday that I was there, we had church at their Japanese church, and this very sweet young family came. They have twins, a boy and a girl. They're both 5 years old. And this couple is a Christian family. They had suffered for many years with infertility, and God finally gave them these twins, a boy and a girl. Well, the boy is on the spectrum.
Okay.
And he has a lot of, I would say, disruptive behavior. Okay. So they're trying their best. They've got him in therapy, and they use noise canceling headphones a lot because he's very, very sensitive to noise. And so it's obviously very challenging for them to be in social situations that are new to him. And sometimes he's going to act up. Yeah. And the heartbreaking thing about it was that they had been attending a church for, a long time. And they weren't point blank asked not to come back, but it was made painfully obvious that they were not welcome to come back because their little boy's behavior was being disruptive to other children. And it just broke my heart for them because, they came and they brought him to this new church. And my daughter was actually giving her testimony that day, and it doesn't have much to do with being on the spectrum, but it does have to do with postpartum depression and sickness and healing. But she was giving her testimony, and, it was, there were painful parts of her testimony and about how God met her where she was and healed her. And this young mom who had been so bruised from her church, her previous church, came up to her just in tears after the testimony saying, your testimony resonated with me because, I heard your heart, and I feel in this place that we are welcome.
Oh, good.
And there were a lot of tears, myself, my daughter, and this lady, because it just breaks my heart and makes me ashamed that a church would shun a family because of their autistic child. Do you want to say anything about that? Or do you think that happens more often than I'm aware of?
I think more often than you're aware of. Mm-hmm. I think that the churches are very often just trying to be pragmatic. Mm-hmm. They're saying, we'd like to help, but your one child is keeping the 15 from learning. Mm-hmm. So we're going to ask you not to come. I think there are things that we can do to make sure we're not that church.
Yeah. What are those things? I'm very eager to know that.
I think one thing we can do is say, be very upfront and honest with the family, and when possible with the child. Mm-hmm. If the child is communicative, and moving on up into adulthood, let's not cut this at children. Sometimes
true.
This affects autistic adults. Mm-hmm. But let's be the ones who ask questions. This isn't working. Can you help me figure out what will? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Our Sunday school, as it isn't supporting your child. Mm-hmm. What can we do?
Right.
We're not kicking anybody out. That's not on our radar. What can we do to make them comfortable here? What will work? Help us help you. Yeah. Let's have those conversations early on so that we're not on our wits' end when we're having the later conversation and saying we've tried stuff. We've tried everything we could think of. It's not working. And then ask for feedback after you do things. Hey, we did this. How did that work? What happened? How did that resonate with you? Did when he went home on Sunday, was he happy? What I think we just miss so many opportunities to get feedback. I don't think my dad would mind me sharing this. He had an autistic adult in his congregation that was coming for a while, and stopped coming. And he said, "Yeah, I don't know if anybody knows why he stopped coming." And I said, "Well, I think he knows. Have you asked him?" And I think very often we miss the opportunity to get just the most valuable feedback because we don't ask for it. Let's ask for feedback. Sometimes we're afraid to hear that it's not working. Negative feedback is a great place to know what we need to fix.
Sometimes it's just messy and we just don't want to engage. And it's easier to just strong arm them, push them away. But I cannot believe that's what Jesus would want us to do.
No, I don't.
He says, let the little children come. I think he also includes those who have special needs.
I do too. And I think it's helpful not to, it's hard not to, when you talk about special needs ministries, it almost always comes up where somebody says, let the least of these. And it's really hard not to think of them as the least of these. They're not. No. My word, some of the most gifted individuals you will ever meet are among this population.
That's right.
The ones who, are profoundly impacted and you can make, they will bless your congregation like no other. Let them. They're not the least of these, and you're doing yourself no favor by treating them as such.
They're not lesser, are they?
I don't think when Jesus gave us that verse, that's what he was saying about anybody. He doesn't treat anyone like the least of these. He's trying to fix our mindset about them.
I feel like the least of these probably means something different to us, a nuance. It has a bit of a different nuance for us than what was intended in that reference. The least could just be the smallest,
Yeah, the Zacchaeus among us.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think we need to fix our thinking about that for sure. But and a lot of times too, our thinking about what works and doesn't work in a church situation, why is it the rule? I have a very fast and loose relationship with rules. I think my parents would have told you that, having raised me up. But yeah, I have a
Did you ask why a lot, April?
Oh, so many times. And I get to the point where I'm like, do you have scripture and verse for that? Can you show me where that's in the Bible? Why?
Let me just say that I'm, of a certain age where that was not in any way encouraged in my era. But I do want to say that I was always made that way. I was kind of a natural skeptic. Sometimes I would be accused of, being smart-mouthed. But I wasn't really being smart-mouthed. I mean, I'm not saying I never was, but sometimes I was accused of it when it wasn't the case, because I really did want to know why.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I saw the inconsistency and thought, wait, that doesn't make sense. I wasn't trying to find the holes. I just was finding them. And so you probably were too.
Oh, all the time. And
your brother Nathan probably was too.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not even the holes, but just if it's not working and it's not Bible,
right?
Then let's find what does work.
Yes,
there's a lot of boxes we put ourselves in for no reason.
That is the absolute truth. I'm curious to know, as a mom, you had expectations of what your babies and your toddlers and your elementary students and, your children, how they would progress, how they would develop. And, you said earlier, I love the way you said it, the gift was not unwrapping in the way that you thought it would. There were surprises along the way. I think anyone who has children, particularly like more than one child, multiple children, can relate to this, whether they have a child on the spectrum or just, different personalities of children. What advice do you give to moms when parenting isn't looking exactly like they thought it would, or their child is not the dream child that they dreamed of having? What is your advice for them, April, from just your experience and your knowledge?
I think meet the child where they're at. For me, and this won't apply to everybody, but for me, I've had to be very cognizant that adulthood begins in preschool. That what skills I want them to carry through life are the ones I need to focus on now. And I can spend a lot of time focusing on skills that will not matter in 15 years. I could care less in 15 years how fast he can do his multiplication tables and whether he can kick a soccer goal. But it matters to me whether he can shop.
Okay.
And it matters to me whether he can be safe in a fire drill.
Okay.
Things like that. And so I've had to be very, very cognizant of what skills he has. And I think one of the things that was so heavy for me when I received the diagnosis was, will I ever be able to share my faith with someone that has communication deficits? And I'm thrilled to say that all three of my children have come to know Christ at this point. But we did I had to step back and rethink how I shared the gospel with someone that struggles with word pictures.
Okay.
So
how is it different? How is it different how you share with them?
Well, for instance, he wouldn't really respond to any like, ask Jesus to come into your heart. That's
Gotcha.
not,
doesn't compute.
Doesn't compute. What does that mean? And
and that's not actually biblical language anyway.
It's not. And so we had to be very intentional about saying, this means that from the time you pray to become a Christian, you will make choices based on what God tells you in the Bible instead of what you just want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very,
that makes so much sense to me too. Mm-hmm.
It's a very clunky way. It doesn't flow with the Romans road like we're trained to give it. But it helped me hone my skills and say, what matters? What does he need to know? And so I think, at the baby shower, is it what I pictured on that day? No. Is it in some ways a million times better? Yes.
Isn't that God, though? Isn't that true?
Yes. Is it sometimes a million times harder? Also, yes.
Yes.
Is it not about me? Also, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think since the baby shower, it hasn't really been about me.
Right.
And I try to keep that in mind. I know when you reached out and asked me if I would speak about my story and things, I said, I'd love to. I need to get my kids' permission first because
that's very wise.
There's just no way to separate my story from their diagnosis. And at some point in my life, I don't want my kids to look back and say, Mom used me to get on podcasts.
No, I think you've said everything wonderful and loving about your children today. That's great because you treasure them. You obviously consider them one of God's greatest blessings to you.
Oh, they're jewels.
And even their diagnoses, I can tell you are considering that a blessing from all the things you've learned.
And I think it's important for women, especially who are going through this process and aren't there. That's okay.
There's some grief initially, isn't there?
There is.
The loss of that dream.
You're allowed to feel how you feel.
Yeah, however you feel. Yes.
When you have life, when someone tells you that your life is not going to look the way you pictured at the baby shower, at the wedding shower, at the whatever it was, you're allowed to feel, and you should feel. But at the end of the day, what do you act? How do you act? And I wanted to make sure that every action that I took pointed my kids to Christ.
And I'm so glad that you've been able to pass your faith along to your children. And let me ask you one question just for clarification. You said, am I ever going to be able to share my faith with someone who doesn't, relate to these word pictures? So let me ask you, is there any aspect of that you're saying that you as an adult on the spectrum, is it difficult for you to share your faith?
I don't think it's hard for me to share my faith.
Okay, that's wonderful because I think you're doing that. It seems like to me that you have been consistently sharing your faith.
Yeah. And I don't think I had a hard time with word pictures at all growing.
Oh, okay, good.
Not everybody on the spectrum is going to struggle with that.
They struggle with different areas.
Sure. Some do. Others don't. But I think it's been incredibly helpful for me to step back and say, hey, if I can't use terminology like ask Jesus to come into your heart or, I don't know what some of the other things that we use, white as snow and, things like that. Then how can I explain this? What are how can I step back and explain the mechanisms of faith without the pretty stuff that we depend on to make it comfortable? And I think it's made me better.
That's awesome.
Doing that. And so, I think it's something we need to be intentional about. The fact of the matter is 1 in 36 right now is receiving a diagnosis of autism. Now, that doesn't mean 1 in 36 is going to have trouble with word pictures. That doesn't mean 1 in 36. But if you know more than 36 kids, you likely know a child on autism. If you're
that's a little bit larger than a typical classroom, but you could you could almost say 1 in every class.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And more than 1 in some classes.
Yeah. And so
see that.
And the numbers are rising. It's the fastest growing developmental disability.
The You think it's rising, or you think the diagnostic process is getting
I
better?
think it's both.
Good.
I still think we're underdiagnosing girls, so I think that number is going to continue to have the rapid rise for a couple until we figure that piece out.
Okay.
I think the reason we've seen it just explosively rising has been the diagnostic criteria,
Gotcha.
but there's a hereditary aspect to it that we know of. We don't know everything that goes into causing autism, but we know that it's hereditary, and anything that's hereditary is going to multiply.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it makes sense that it's just, and there's environmental aspects as well. Part of that is the social piece. As the world becomes more and more social, the kids who used to be like, oh, he's just the farm kid, he doesn't do well at the store, but he's great on the farm. That's not really a thing in 2023. So that kid's a lot more
functioning differently, isn't it, than it ever has before?
Yeah, so he's a lot more likely to get a diagnosis now that class sizes are 25 instead of 10.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Well, it's been really interesting talking to you, and there's so many things I want to say. You have no idea what's going on in my head right now, just all the different directions that I'm thinking, and my mind is blown. So thank you for making us aware. And I would love to talk a lot more with you about this. And I wonder, April, you said that you're able now as a licensed professional to help parents who are struggling in this area. Are you doing any of that right now?
At the moment, I'm partnering with Good News a little bit, doing some trainings and things like that for their preschool. I am applying for some work.
That's but right Good News is your parents' church?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, okay. In Virginia, I see.
There.
Okay.
But I'm applying for a couple of PhD programs, and I'm not sure how much
work. Be the best in that. I hope that you'll go ahead and do that, pursue that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some which I want to do. So
the church, the Christian community, as well as the community at large, but the Christian community just really needs people with a skill set to help, because like you say, it is on the rise. There are many good, godly parents that don't quite know what to do and how to handle the children God has blessed them with. So I pray that you will find the path that God intends for you, and that He'll use you greatly to be a blessing in the Christian community.
Well, and I'm happy to be a resource for any of the Free Will Baptist churches. You know, I cannot, from a BCBA standpoint, I cannot work with, you know, you can't call me about a particular child and say, hey, what do I do about this? But if you have questions about, we'd like to make our church more autism friendly. We'd like to, you know, maybe train our teachers on how to just be more inclusive, or be, you know, better at handling things. You know, I'm happy to do what I can.
Maybe I should have you write some things for us on that subject, so that we could access those who are, you know, having these issues come up with their church, would be better prepared.
Absolutely.
To all kinds of children that might come to their church. That would be great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you're listening today and you've got a situation that is that this has resonated with you, reach out and comment to us. We would be happy to put resources in your hands if we can. And we just thank you, April, for sharing with us from your story and from your knowledge.
Thank you for the chance.
I feel both way more uninformed than I thought I was, and challenged to become more informed. So that's good. That's a good result for the podcast. So thank you for sharing with us.
No problem. I hope I was helpful. And
yes, you definitely were. Thank you so much. And I appreciate everybody who tuned in today. And I pray that God will be with you and bless you and give you wisdom as you go.